Jerry Gidel on his weekly commentary will talk about the soybean and corn rallies after the U.S. election that is still being counted as we speak. Right here on Connected Farmer, your channel to keep you up to date with the latest trends in agriculture and livestock. Stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe. So, Jerry, we are seeing soybean futures over $11 and
Yes.
corn futures $11.4. So, do you think this is somehow related to the U.S. election outcome or not?
Well, I think the elections, in its own way, I think actually surprisingly, I heard rumors before the election that the financial world felt like, well, maybe this would be a more positive outlook than having the confrontations in the economic world. I don't know that that's really. I think really we got down to the basics of the fact that the U.S. corn crop going into next Tuesday potentially could slip a little bit. We've had really, really good ongoing export sales. And that really is, I think, the key for some of this comeback, and particularly the soybeans, because interesting numbers could come out next Tuesday.
Yes, and do you think those strong soybean prices could remain high?
I think there's a possibility, yes, and I think they might even strengthen a little bit more. What happens here in the U.S. That happens every November is, and in the last few years, we haven't had a real big export lineup out here to get moved through the system here before. The central U.S. really depends a lot on the Mississippi River barge systems and getting that grain down to the Gulf and that type of thing. And that's really been up until, like I said, the last couple of years here, that has not been a factor in this market. So we didn't have this rustle to get things out of people's hands and get it into the barges and getting it down to the Gulf, because in reality, it's so much easier to get it done that way. You get a lot more tonnage, a lot more supply down there. You can take a lot of 100-car railroad cars from the Midwest down there, and you're still not going to fill up one of those big Panamexes. So that's really one of the factors I think is going to help with this thing. We've got I just saw something as we got on here today that we have got the strongest looking ship lineups in the U.S. than we've had in 5 years. So that means we've got boats down there. They want to end up getting them filled and out of here. And I think that's going to help support any kind of setbacks. And if there's any kind of worries in the world production prospects, and we will get some updates on that next Tuesday. On the soybean side, we'll, of course, get maybe some adjustments in South America. I'd say that's going to be modest at this point because it's really early in the season from there. But the one thing we will get is an update on some of the corn output, particularly in Ukraine. There seems to be lots of indications that the Ukrainian crop that the USDA has at 36 million metric tons is going to be like 29 or 30 million metric tons. So that takes out a lot of competition there in the export world. We've had this week's export sales, 103 million bushels, over 2.5 million metric tons. That's impressive. You can't anything to say that it is impressive. And I think that that's an indication that the USDA's export demand on next Tuesday, particularly for corn, could potentially go up. I think soybeans is even more likely it's going to go up because of how tight we've got our sales here against the USDA projection. Don't want to get too far afield here, but the reality on the soybeans is that we got 81% of the USDA's projection already sold. Now, that kind of says that we need to have a higher projection. But at the same time, the one thing that's driven this thing has been the Chinese buying. And they are in a situation where they're going to go up to a certain point, and then they're going to look to South America, Brazil and Argentina for supplies and that. So there's been concerns even voiced in some parts of the trade that all of a sudden the cliff is going to happen and no Chinese buying. But the problem is we also have, not a problem, but the other portion of this thing is that we do have sales going to other parts of the world too, and that could easily come in here. But I'd have to say there's really a tense situation in the next month to try to get the sales we already have in the books, get those through the system, and get them out into to the buyers out there. And so that's going to give us, I think, some concerns. And at this point, the exports, the world numbers next Tuesday will be important in both corn and soybeans. And finally, we're going to get to the crop size again. Well, that's the next subject. Let's talk about that just a little bit. We'll break here for a bit.
Yeah, who else is buying other than China?
Well, interestingly, this week, in part of that corn sale that was over 100 million bushels, probably about 40 million of that was to our friends to the south of the border here in Mexico. They have been, and probably this year will be number 2 after being number 1 for the last 2 or 3 years. They overtook Japan, who used to be a very strong buyer of U.S. corn. And that, but the Japanese have abandoned us and went to the Black Sea and Ukraine. Well, maybe they're going to come back too. We'll figure that out later. But those are the kind of buyers. I think also there's a little shaky in the European markets. We really don't have a lot of ability to get in there because of the tariffs that they have on for U.S. kind of grains for as much to do with our GMO corn that has to do with the actual prices. It's their preference is not to use that type of seed. Soybeans, they seem to avoid that theory that there's something wrong with the seeds there because the U.S. and Brazil is about the only 2 places you can buy beans, and guess what? Both of them use GMO seeds. So it's an interesting world. I guess you always have your own perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and some people are saying that the U.S. Will be out of soybeans. It's really interesting because at the beginning of the season, we were talking about more carryover than we have now. So, what do you think of all of that talk?
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. There has been a complete switch from where we were back in May and June of both corn and soybeans. Now, I can't say corn is to the point of we're going to run out, but it's going to be very tight because I really, at this point, let's say that I personally think we're going to have about a bushel, maybe I think there's a bushel and a half less on production. That takes off a crop size here of about 120 million, and then you turn around and maybe you end up having 75 million more of exports because of the fact that we've had strong exports. We might slip a little bit on ethanol, but I'd have to say that the overall number, I've got a number just a smidgen, 2 billion and 3 million above that kind of magic number. 2 billion used to be a billion back in the day. We got so much more demand, and our stocks-to-use ratio is still very tight. Actually, at that level, we could project a stocks-to-use ratio clear back as low as it was back in 2015, which, as you think about it, here is 5 years back. That's quite a significant change. Moving over to the soybeans, that's the one that really has the most interesting dynamics. I'd have to say that, considering we're at 81% of the projection, boy, you'd think that they might go up another 100 or 150. Well, they did go 75 last time, and interesting, if you have a slightly smaller crop of half a bushel or so, just 40 million off, then you turn around and have another 40 million of exports. Man, all of a sudden that 290 million we had here last month could be close to 200. I've got a 204 number, and that I've seen some numbers below 200 million, and that isn't not impossible. I have to say that I'm a little cautious on what I think the most aggressive situation the USDA could put out there. But if we had a number here of under 200 million, I think that would really spark the markets here, because then it's going to be, whoa, we better get my last purchases in here before it's all gone. It will never be all gone. It will ration the price the high enough that it won't be all gone. And also, it's a long ways before we really know what South America's crops are. I know they're off to a very, very shaky start here. We had late plantings. That's part of the reason why the Chinese have come in to buy January and February beans here recently. If that continues, and right now we've talked about what I think we're 50% in last week in Mato Grosso, and we'll probably be 75%, 80%. Problem is, it's still dry down there. You put a seed in the ground, it's not got a moist seed bed, it's not coming up. That just you plant it doesn't mean it's going to be growing and be able to be harvested in the first part of February. So there's still a lot of uncertainty here as to what size the crop is. I doubt the USDA is going to change their 133 number. Most of the trade is. It's a long ways away, and it makes so much difference what the weather is during the growing season. But it won't get there if it doesn't get it in the ground and start to grow. And right now it's been behind and not really growing very fast. So that's going to be a big feature here. And so to me, interestingly enough, that possibility of, we've been up back to this $11 mark, and 11 to 11.20 is kind of an interesting spot. If we get through there, we might be moving on up to the next magic number.
Yes, indeed, the USDA is always tends to be very conservative in terms of their projections. Mm-hmm. But I will shift to corn right now. I sort of played with Jared last week about the corn price on Wednesday. We don't have a winner of this election, but what can you say about the future demand for U.S. energy products related to corn, like ethanol?
Well, interestingly enough, the ethanol side of this market has kind of stagnated because of the combination of less driving in the U.S. because so many more people are working from home. And now we're into a secondary wave, if you say, on the energy side here, or the COVID side that's impacting the energy. The one big twist that we found out the tail end of last week, and if we looked at this week's U.S. Ethanol output, is the fact that we did finally start to see an export sale of ethanol to China. And that, to me, is something that is quite interesting, because I know that the ethanol industry over there is, whining about importing ethanol. But the interesting thing about it is that the difference between U.S. ethanol over there being delivered to them versus what it's costing them over there to try to end up helping their environmental issues is still quite wide. And boy, that would sure take up a lot of the infamous phase one levels of demand. So I guess I'm kind of come see, come saw. I don't think the U.S. demand is going to be as good. I'm kind of slightly optimistic that we're going to start to see our ethanol demand to stay firmer than you think, because what we just started to see, maybe the tip of the iceberg on the overseas demand led by China in this situation. The corn side, it's an interesting world out here. We've got livestock numbers maybe not so strong. Exports are looking fantastic. Ethanol is kind of in between. But in general, we're so much lower than where we were in projections back in May. There was people talking 3 billion plus. Now we're a heck of a lot closer to 2 billion. That's a whole different ballgame.
And what do you expect for next week?
Well, I kind of feel like that. I guess I'm looking for a surprise in these carryover stocks, and thinking that we might break the magic 2 billion on corn and 200 million on beans. I didn't project it from there because, as you pointed out, the USDA is kind of conservative and sometimes doesn't do that. But I'd also say that what I talked about to lead our discussions today, the idea of being able to get these sales that are already in the books and the ships that are down there and the need to get it out of here if there's anything that's just not tip top, maybe it stays too dry in South America. Maybe we end up, I don't know. There's not going to be much in the political world, I think, is going to have an impact on it. I don't think if it's confirmed that Biden wins, that's going to derail the situation, because we have so much economic issues going on right now that have to be satisfied for the purchases that are already in the books. I just feel like this thing could be quite. It's kind of the post-harvest rally. That's something that's not been around in a while. A post-harvest rally in corn and soybeans, but I think there is a possibility of that between now and early December, when the U.S. Mississippi freezes up and we don't have any transportation coming out of that major producing area of the U.S.
Always great to talk with you, Jerry. Thanks.
You bet. Take care, and look forward to see if I'm right next week. We kind of shaky last week, but we didn't go too bad.